Welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John, and today we're continuing our discussion of patterns of racism. Now keep in mind, racism unfortunately was given a huge bolster by early science because unfortunately science is a social product. I mean, we are scientists, but at the same time as sociologists, we have to recognize that science is a product of society. And there are many different ways in which society is going to influence science. So one is by the initial biases that people begin with, the initial views that they start with. And another is by funding, right? So if you say things people like to hear, you're going to get funded, right? Now, some scientists may deliberately skew their research in order to promote their own views. Now, this is what science is supposed to correct, and science has corrected this. So, for example, scientists no longer believe any of this stuff. But it was so popular for a long time, the point is it had an influence on science, right? So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, many biologists did research on race, arguing that different races had different levels of intelligence. You had Arthur de Gobineau, he was a French author. He was the one who wrote that there were three: the white, the black, and the yellow, right? The Caucasians, Africans, and Mongoloids. And furthermore, usually there was a belief that racial mixing would somehow create a collapse of civilization, right? Samuel George Morton, he was an American physical anthropologist, very famous for collecting skulls and measuring the size of each cranium by putting sand in. Now, it turns out that brain size and intelligence have relatively little to do with each other, right? As you know, if you have dogs, you might have a dog with a very small brain that's very smart, and a dog with a very big head that's not very smart. Right? So the point is, brain size by itself means nothing. But yet, that was a big thing. And not only that, but the guy, in order to reinforce his beliefs, he actually changed evidence in many cases. Like if you had a big brain from an African guy, he would like hide it. Right? We don't need that piece of evidence. Right? And again, but yet these theories were very easily accepted by society because people wanted theories that would justify white domination over other groups, right? And this was because of colonialism, it was because of slavery, it was because of genocide. So if you could say, well, these people are inferior, then that justified these things. It justified slavery. You say, well, they're slaves because they're not like us. They're not civilized like us. Or we have to colonize them to help them because they're not fully developed like us. Or even in the case of genocide, look, we had to kill them because they're using space and we're superior and we deserve to have that space. So one way or the other, these theories were very influential in helping to justify these things. But I think people would have done them anyway. They would have found other ways to justify them. I don't think the scientists really had that much of an impact. They just helped. Right? As I said, after World War II, and we saw the result of these beliefs, I mean, what happened with Nazi Germany and the massacre of millions and millions of people, not just people in concentration camps. We know that 11 million people were killed in concentration camps, but also just massacres of people in fields, in forests, widespread atrocities, the widespread bombing of cities because, according to the Nazis, the people were inferior. Anyway, so you might as well kill them all. So a very good book that deals with this topic is Stephen Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, how these biologists did this. So what is the real basis of racial and ethnic stratification? Well, first of all, migration. The reality is human beings have diversified because they migrated to different parts of the planet where they had different environmental factors this played into, minor changes like skin color, nose shape to a certain extent, some other things such as leg length and things like that. So these could help them adapt to the local climates. And all of them were extremely minor changes in genetic patterns. The difference between different humans around the world is a very small amount of the total gene pool. But in recent years, with colonization, with technology, suddenly people are moving all over the place, right? So first of all, white people from Europe went and conquered or occupied areas in the Americas, in Asia. They went to Australia. They took over the entire Americas and established colonies and domination over people in large areas of Asia. So this created a lot of contact, a lot of wars, and situations where people are basically one group dominating over another. And of course, anytime this happens, or typically when this happens, you have an unequal relationship. Either the migrant group, the group migrating, is in power. This was very often the case of European migrant groups, or at least the initial ones, English, French, Spanish. So when the Spanish went to America, they were a migrant group, but they were super ordered. They were on top. So basically the migrants conquer or annex new territory. Same when the Mongols came to Europe, or at least as far as Persia, they conquered. They became the super group, right? The superior group. When Europeans went and conquered the other way, they were the superior group. Now in other cases, the migrants come in as subordinate. So, for example, Latin Americans migrating to the United States don't come in as a dominant group; they come in as a subordinate group, and very often they're taken advantage of for labor and other things, right? By the same token, you have constantly people moving on because people are looking for a better to survive, right? Maybe there's a war. Maybe there's political oppression, maybe there's economic collapse. So you're trying to look for a better opportunity. So different migration factors that may affect stratification. Is it voluntary or involuntary? When you have involuntary migration, for example, slaves, if you're grabbed as a slave and you're taken to another place, your power is far less because you have nobody to support you, right? You're broken up from the places you're from. You're far away from them. You don't have an embassy you can go to and say, "Oh, I was kidnapped," right? Voluntary means people go voluntarily. So dominant groups, migrant groups, they volunteer. They go and they conquer a territory. That would be the superordinate case. In the middle, there are voluntary groups who agree to go to a new territory, even if they're not going to conquer it, but they're going to live there. Support by home government. So, for example, if you come from a society where there's a powerful government, that's going to back you up. So very often, those are the superordinate groups, like the English going to America, the Spanish going to America, the Dutch going to conquer Southeast Asia, right? So their home government support them. Again, if you come from Europe to America today, somebody tries to take advantage of you, you have your embassy. You can go and you can get support from your embassy. But if you were a slave brought from Africa in the 1500s, there was no support from your home government. Chinese immigrants to the United States, again, China was often ignored as a power in the world. People felt China was a joke, so they didn't pay attention. They didn't care. So they was unable to give their migrant support. Other factors, what skills, what money, do they bring in money with them? Do they bring in skills? Some migrant groups are very skilled, like Germans who came to America tended to be from skilled groups. Irish people who came to America tend to be farmers, and therefore they didn't have those skills. Timing. Was there a welcoming environment when they came, or was the economy closed? Again, Germans, when they came to America, came during a time when the Midwest was opening up for home ownership, and they moved out to the Midwest. Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, these became German colonies almost. Whereas other groups, like the Irish again, or Russians who came later, they ended up just in the cities. There was nowhere to go. There was no free land anywhere. So they ended up either as laborers on the railroad or as laborers in cities, etc. Reasons, economic versus political. Economic migrants obviously are coming because they're poor, and that's going to affect one of the, what they bring with them, the amount of money. Political migrants tend to be migrating for political reasons. They tend to be from higher social strata, and they tend to have more money with them. And finally, cultural or physical similarity to the host culture. So a group that comes in that is very similar can blend in, can assimilate, they can get along. They may even be rewarded, like English immigrants to New York, even today, because they're English. People are like, oh, you have such a cute accent. I like your accent so much, right? So they look the same as the dominant white Anglos, and they talk in a very cute way. So they're even privileged, almost, right? But black or Hispanic, a Dominican, or even a Russian, or a Pole who comes in, they would have wide cultural differences. Maybe they're Catholic, or their skin color is different, or other things are different. Patterns of interaction. So this is going to be a bit long to describe, but essentially there are about 8 or 9 general patterns of interaction between dominant and subordinate groups. So the first is blending, right? Blending means that basically one group becomes like the other, or they blend together. So in assimilation, for example, the subordinate group generally blends into the dominant group. So Europeans in the United States have tended to blend in to the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group. It may take some time, it may take several generations, and it will depend on how different they were to begin with, and the other factors we were talking about before, what the issues were and things like that. When Irish, a lot of Irish and Russians and Poles came to the United States, there was a lot of initial antagonism because they were Catholic, right? So just because they were white didn't mean they were accepted. They were Catholic. They were the wrong religion. So many of them felt like they had to give up their Catholicism and become Protestant in order to survive. So that's an example of assimilation or culture, maybe even cultural genocide, where people give up or are forced to surrender their entire culture. Sometimes this may be forced. So, for example, in many European countries, everybody is forced to learn the dominant language. In France, you have people who say, no, we're originally German. We want to learn German. French government says, nope, you're in France. You learn French. Right? And in the United States, this has also happened in the past through public education and other means. So there may be an aspect of, some people argue, quote-unquote, cultural genocide. We'll talk about that more later. And now, amalgamation means that over time, the population combines to such an extent that you can there's no longer any significant difference within them or between them. So, for example, England, if you look at England itself, historically England is made up of very widely disparate ethnic groups. You've got Celts, the original Celts. You had Romans who came in as a dominant group. Then you had Anglo-Saxons coming in. Then you had Vikings coming in the north. You had other ethnic groups invading from Scotland and Ireland and Wales. So essentially, England has amalgamated, or the argument is amalgamated these into a single culture. How successful that is, well, I guess you could leave it up to debate. But most English people would not go back and say, oh, I'm a Celtic Englishman, I'm an Anglo, I'm a what do you call it, French Englishmen, right? Because the Normans invaded England too, right? So you would not know today that for 300 years the official language of England was French. Before that, the official language of England was German. Right? It was the combination of those two. When they amalgamated, they created English. And the other basic pattern is separation. In other words, keeping ethnic or racial groups separated. Now, this may be relatively voluntary, or it may be forced. So, for example, pluralism usually refers to a situation where ethnic groups voluntarily remain distinct. So Switzerland is often argued to be one of the ideal cases in the world where you have three main ethnic groups, the Italian, French, and German-speaking Swiss. But they share the land, they share the same basic belief structures, they share a government, but yet each area has its own cultural ethnicity. Right? So they're distinct, but they're equal. So pluralism creates this sign of equality. Another example of this is Canada today, with the French and the English-speaking Canadians in different parts. Again, have legal equality, but they're different. Now, Yugoslavia was a country that was like that, but then it broke up into different parts and they started fighting. So we don't necessarily include Yugoslavia as a good example of that. Segregation, when one group dominates the other and takes advantage of it. So in other words, what they'll do is they will say, okay, we'll let you be here, but we're going to take advantage of you and you cannot stop us. And they're legally segregated, they're forced to live, or at least either live separately or behave as if they live separately. Right? So in America, we had a system called Jim Crow, which was developed after slavery was abolished. They developed Jim Crow, and Jim Crow meant that if you were black, you were not given the same rights as if you were white, essentially. Your rights were very limited. You couldn't eat in the same place. You couldn't go to the same parks. You couldn't sometimes even walk on the same sidewalk. On the buses, you had to sit in the back of the bus, or you had to stand. So all these things were done to denigrate the black people, to make them look worse. And, but yet they were still part of the same society and the same economy, but they were paid less. So that basically allowed them to be exploited and taken advantage of. Now, nationalism is a more extreme version of the same thing, and it could happen two ways. Either the majority group uses nationalism against the minority group, and that gets almost into our third category here, or sometimes minority groups will want to create their own separate nation. So Quebec in Canada, sometimes they say, we want to be separate, we don't want to be part of Canada, we don't like having all these English people around us. So nationalism is when either the minority group or the majority group become very nationalistic, and this may significantly damage the relationships between the different ethnic groups. And the final pattern of interaction is basically displacement. As I said, nationalism may, if the dominant group is nationalistic, they may end up either excluding, which means literally pushing away the minority group. So, for example, in the United States, American Indians were literally pushed away. They did not want to include them as part of the same society. They had to leave. And this was so strong, even when they wrote the Constitution, they wrote that American Indians cannot be citizens of the United States. It was in the Constitution, right? So this is a complete separation, and it could get worse, of course. There could be physical extermination. If they do not agree to leave, we'll kill you. And in fact, extermination was used in some cases against American Indians. Of course, much more common to us today is the example of genocide in Nazi Germany, in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia even to some extent, and other places where you've had a systematic attempt by one group to wipe out the other group from the territory. Kill them all, get rid of them. And I just added on to the end cultural genocide. This goes back to assimilation almost in a circle, because some people argue that, for example, if you were to take all the Native Americans, okay, we don't kill them, we're not going to expel them, but we're going to take their children and teach them and have them grow up to be American, to basically be wasps, right? So when you do that, you're not killing the people, but you're killing the culture. You destroy the culture. And so there is some debate that does assimilation itself imply cultural genocide or the destruction of the sense of peopleness of a group of people? Well, folks, we're going to now be discussing and applying these to various different groups in American history. So I hope this has helped you understand these issues. Thank you very much. This is the end of Lecture 3B. Make sure you check the companion for other assignments before you do the quiz. All right? Bye-bye.